Hello everyone, Minus here after a short holiday weekend break. We are back to covering the class changes for Pantheon Rise of the Fallen, which unveiled via their website update on August 30th, 2020. Gather your focus and help us tame the destructive forces of the Arcane as we dig into Pantheon's Wizard.
Pantheon Plus.
So starting in the general info listed at the top of the page, as we have seen with the rest of the new class pages, Wizard has had its role clarified, and rather than listing magical DPS and utility as it did on the previous site, it now simply lists damage. Wizards were previously listed to have 3 different combat resources to manage. These were mana, focus, and spell weaving. However, now the Wizard simply lists focus and mana. Wizards are listed as being able to wear the lowest tier of AC in cloth armor. Previously, under weapons, wizards were also listed to be able to use what was quoted as certain shields. That has now been clarified in the armor section and now states that they can use arcane shields. On the previous wizard class page, they had the following weapons listed: one-handed piercing and blunt, two-handed staves, and certain one-handed edged weapons. Now, however, weapons listed are clarified slightly as dagger, sword, club, stave, quarterstaff, and longstaff. The same 5 races are available to select when playing a wizard, which are Arcane, Darkmere, Elf, Human, and Gnome. So let's jump from there into the new or changed abilities listed for the wizard. Now we're going to go a little more in depth on some of these that maybe didn't change a ton, but are important to know when wanting to play a wizard. So let's start by talking about the wizard's core mechanic of building focus. Essentially, the wizard grows in effect and power of whatever spell type they continue to cast. These 3 are Fire, Cold, and Arcane, so let's dig into each one. Fire Focus, previously called Focus Fury of Flame, this passive effect grows in charges to a maximum of 5 stacks. Each stack of Fire Focus when casting a fire spell will cause you to gain fire damage, spell haste, and critical chance. Additionally, the fire spells themselves will continue to grow in mana cost. This is mostly unchanged. However, the previous version of the focus did not include spell haste increases. So this is a nice add-on. We just really probably got to watch that mana spend. Now the next one, which is Cold Focus, was previously called Focus Numbing Presence. And much like the Fire Focus, when you cast cold spells, you gain up to 5 stacks of focus. And similar, with each charge of your cold spells, you'll gain damage, spell haste, and critical damage. Also, as we'd seen before with Fire Focus, the spell costs of the cold spells will continue to go up as they increase in power. Now, the interesting thing is that this has changed pretty considerably. Previously, Numbing Presence would lower the hate regeneration and actually decrease the damage of your cold spells. It didn't previously increase in mana cost either. It appears rather than having the cold focus be strictly for hate decrease, they have given the wizard more flexibility to deal cold damage rather than fire being the main source of all damage for all wizards. And finally is Arcane Focus, previously called Focus Arcane Affinity. This causes the wizard to gain a stack of Arcane Focus when casting Prism Volley in succession. With each cast, Prism Volley will return an increasing amount of mana to the wizard when it lands. Additionally, the mana cost will go down for each stack in regards to Prism Volley. This is similar to what was stated on the old site. However, it used to state that all arcane spells would do this, and now it has been clarified to a single spell. This is an interesting change, which means you'll get mana back as you'll be spamming this singular spell. Now, getting into the spells themselves that are listed and outside of focus, Glint is a cold spell which not only damages the enemy, but also puts them in a chilled state. Previously, this spell listed as dealing damage and reducing movement speed. Detonate Ice is a self-caused detonation of our Frozen Fortress spell. This was previously called Shatter the Ice. Moving on to your fire spells, Evoke Fire now criticals if an enemy is in a burning state, which previously listed it would critical if the enemy was in a weakened state. Inferno Lance has changed slightly. First, it's still a charged ability, which is nice to see. However, it no longer states that it leaves a burning shockwave damaging all enemies in front of you, and is now worded in a way that makes it seem like it is a single target strike. Perhaps this is something that will be added via the mastery system. Prism Volley appears to be a totally new ability, as mentioned above in the Arcane Focus explanation. It returns mana to you as it damages an enemy. Now it's hard to say if this is a rename and a change to the ability which was known as Prism Burst prior. However, the old spell would hit an enemy and also cause a burst of AoE damage around them. So again, perhaps it is the same ability, but maybe we'll see the AoE damage come in with a little bit of mastery. I can't confirm completely that this is a change to that spell, but it seems the closest and the other is not listed, so we're going to go with that for right now. So let's get into those spells that are no longer listed. So first, the brands aren't listed, and these are the brands of Frost, Arcane, and Embers. So essentially, these are just spells the wizard could cast to lower the resistance to the appropriate spell type listed by the brand on the enemy, obviously making it easier for the wizard to land spells. I assume these will probably come back. Shelter of the Energies is a self buff that would increase maximum HP and AC. Next is Summon Arcane Familiar. So the familiar would absorb mana from around the environment equal to a percentage of your maximum mana. While it was active, it'll feed you a percent of the mana it has every so many seconds. The wizard would also be able to consume it all by dismissing and absorbing the familiar. As we saw in the current spell list, they also can summon a fire familiar, so I'm curious to see if they can summon a cold familiar. So that'll do it for the missing abilities that were sort of utility or base to the wizard, which means a lot were still covered in the spells that are listed currently. However, we did see quite an omission within the fire and arcane abilities, so let's go over what is no longer listed on the site currently. First is Smolder, which was a direct fire damage spell. Char was listed as a spell which was a woven ability, which would do extra damage after Smolder. And Engulf was another spell woven ability, which would be done after Char, and also does higher fire damage over time. Radiate Heat would surround you with a fiery mana, dealing fire damage to all enemies around you. Fiery Surge would release a wave of mana, doing an AoE around the caster. Crew Vinoth's Fiery Winds would summon a tempest of fire-filled winds and direct it where to go, dealing damage to all in its path. Ember Arrow would impale your enemy with a bolt of burning mana, dealing high fire damage and causing them to burn. Torch the Glacier was a channeled spell, dealing fire damage to an enemy, and it was interesting because it would deal increased damage to enemies based on their cold resist, kind of taking cold and fire and making them work together. Crew Vinoth's Fiery Gale was actually an evolution to Fiery Winds. In this case, it would increase the damage affected in enemies greatly, and when it reaches its destination, it would cause a violent explosion dealing AoE damage. Again, as said earlier, this would probably be a great mastery upgrade to the original spell of Fiery Winds. And finally, Fire Flash was a damage and knockback, which would hit an enemy with a large sphere of fiery mana. So that was a lot of fire spells that are no longer listed, and I'm curious to see how they either come back as they were, or are reinvented in the future. Now, the following arcane abilities were no longer listed. This is Blast of Lightning, which you would send a bolt of electrified mana through an enemy, reducing their spellcasting speed. Fractal Jolt would stun your enemy briefly and interrupt spellcasting, and Magical Bonds would slow an enemy's movement speed. The final spell was Lightning Volley. This would cast multiple bolts of lightning rapidly forward. Now, if you had an enemy targeted, all the bolts would strike that enemy, and if not, the lightning would strike enemies within X meters in front of you randomly. So it's interesting because there were a lot of fire abilities omitted from this reveal, and again, remember, this does not mean these spells are gone, they're just not yet revealed, or they may be slightly undergoing changes. So while the wizard remains heavily intact from what we knew about it via the old website, there are a few key things to note. First, the old setup seemed to be very heavy fire for damage, cold for control, and arcane for mana regen or utility. At least that's how the focuses sort of worked. Now it appears that fire and cold are both suitable for increased damage, while arcane stays focused on regenerating mana. I'm interested to see how fire and cold will play together for the wizard, or if we'll see specialized wizards between fire or cold. On the new website, they highlighted all the cold spells, which is pretty interesting, but left off a great deal of the fire abilities. I, for one, am excited for this change, as I think I'd prefer a wizard to have options for heavy damage and not just having to cast fire spells. It'll be very interesting to see how this plays out. I feel like you will be able to cast a familiar as well for each focus type to help build focus or increase the abilities that the focus is intended on keying on, much like we see for the fire or the arcane familiar. I'm interested to see what the cold familiar does, as I feel we will certainly see the ability to lower resistances on enemies that improves the wizard's ability to land spells. The wizard class in my eyes has always been one of the heavy damage classes, and it still looks to be that way. Are you a fan of the wizard class? Do you think these slight changes to focus are going to help? Join us as we finalize all 12 of our class updates with the shaman in our next video. We truly appreciate all of those of you who have decided to come on this ride with us through these updates and changes we've seen across all classes. Please leave comments below and let us know what you think of the videos, and check out our others to find your favorite class. Until next time.